Hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is The Advocate, and today I am an advocate for A Clash of Kings, a rereader's review. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I've completed a reread of A Clash of Kings, and I decided to make another video and share with you guys my thoughts on this amazing book. So just a heads up, guys, I did not prepare a script for this video. This video is completely just kind of off the cuff, my own thoughts. I thought maybe that would be a better format for these reviews. However, I did prepare a few notes here on this sheet of paper right here to kind of keep my thoughts straight. If you didn't watch my first video, Game of Thrones, a rereader's review, I'm approaching these books through a rereader's perspective. I've already read the 5 published books for the A Song of Ice and Fire series, so I already know what happens in the series. However, the number one thing that I'm looking at when I'm rereading these books are things that I missed, things that I may feel differently on this reread than I did when I originally read these books a long time ago. On top of that, I'm also approaching these books from the perspective of someone who's only read the books and not watched the TV show. However, before we get any further ahead in this review, I just want to let you guys know that this first part of this review, I will not be delving into spoilers for A Clash of Kings. I will, however, be delving into spoilers from the first book, A Game of Thrones, and using that as the basis for this spoiler-free section of A Clash of Kings. So if you've not read the first Game of Thrones book, please click off this video because I'll be spoiling stuff from A Game of Thrones. However, once I've gotten my spoiler-free thoughts out of the way, I will go full bore on these spoilers. Not just for A Clash of Kings, but how A Clash of Kings relates to the remainder of the series. So that means I'll be spoiling everything that's been published in all 5 books. So if you've not read A Clash of Kings, and on top of that have not read the books after A Clash of Kings, then click off the video whenever we get to the timestamp in my description below, because I will be spoiling everything whenever we get to that section. But until then, this first part will be spoiler-free, so let's get to it. So A Clash of Kings is the sequel to the first book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series, A Game of Thrones. A Clash of Kings was released on November 16, 1998, 2 years right after the Game of Thrones book. So from what I recall from my first read-through of A Clash of Kings, I recall that I actually really liked the book, which surprised me because I heard that A Clash of Kings was usually people's second or maybe even least favorite. But I never got that vibe when I first read this book. I really liked the book. I thought it was a worthy follow-up to A Game of Thrones. And after this reread, I still feel the same way. However, there are some things in the second book that I didn't quite like as much when I first read the book. So let's talk about the things that I actually liked about A Clash of Kings, both on my first read-through and on the second read-through. When I first read this book, I was already in love with the characters that we were introduced to in A Game of Thrones, so to kind of see their follow-up stories in A Clash of Kings, I was fully on board already from the get-go. Tyrion Lannister, Catelyn Stark, Bran Stark, Arya Stark, Sansa Stark, I wanted to know more about what happened on their journeys. I was fully committed to their story, so to learn more about what happens after the events of A Game of Thrones with the death of Ned Stark, I wanted to learn more. I wanted to see where else this book went. So that for me on my first read-through was very enjoyable. The thing that I loved on my second read-through of this book was, now that I know what happens after this book and in the later books in the series, I was able to catch a lot of nuggets of foreshadowing that I didn't really catch in my first read-through. There is a lot of information here that basically plants the seeds for huge events that are to come later on down in the story. And to see those happen in this book, as we're introduced to a couple new characters and introduced to a couple of little plot nuggets here and there, and see how they pay off later in the series, is very rewarding to read through, because as a rereader, you're like, I know this is where this is going. This is going to a not fun place, but man, this is where it all started. Okay. With that said, something that I also did catch on my second read-through of A Clash of Kings that I maybe overlooked on my first read-through of A Clash of Kings was that the book is a little slow in the middle. And by slow, I mean there's a couple chapters here and there that don't really lead to anything substantial, both in this book or in the follow-up books that follow A Clash of Kings. There's quite a few chapters that I don't really see what the purpose of this chapter is. Some of these chapters, were they really necessary? They just seem like they're maybe taking space from another plot line that maybe we as the audience are more interested in. This book does have a little bit more filler than A Game of Thrones had. And that's something that I didn't really notice on my first read through, and I think I only noticed it now because after my reread of A Game of Thrones, where everything was concise, everything had a purpose, with this book I didn't necessarily feel that. Certainly the story was good, and there were a lot of chapters that did contribute to the overall story, but there's sections of this book where I'm like, oh, like we're still here? Or, oh, I thought we would have already gotten here. Or what are we still doing at this location with these characters? It definitely felt a lot like filler. The other thing I was looking at with these chapters was like, okay, well, maybe if they don't have a purpose to the plot, are they building character? Are we delving more into into who that person is? And truth be told, some of these chapters, no, I didn't really glean any additional insight into who the point of view character is, or who the supporting characters are in that point of view chapter, that I didn't already know about in previous chapters. It just seemed like you could easily remove some of these chapters and nothing would be lost from the overall A Clash of Kings story. Another thing that I caught on this reread that I didn't really catch on my first read through was just the general layout of this book. Now, what I mean by that is, in the first Game of Thrones book, we're immediately introduced to who we believe the main character is. Actually, who is the main character in that book, Ned Stark. Eddard Stark is a huge pivotal part of the Game of Thrones book. He has the most chapters in that book at 15 chapters, but on top of that, there's so many chapters where Ned Stark is a supporting character. He shows up in half of the Arya Stark chapters. He shows up in several of the Sansa Stark chapters and a lot of the Catelyn chapters at the beginning of the book. A good, I would say, 60% of that first book is dedicated to the story of Ned Stark and how he is trying to unravel the murder mystery around Jon Arryn. He is the central narrative of that book. This book, after the death of Ned Stark, which, narratively speaking, it was the most interesting route they could have taken, it feels a little bit like a decentralized narrative. Tyrion Lannister has the most chapters in this book at 15, the same amount as Ned Stark, but with Ned Stark, there were so many other characters that were glued to the Ned Stark character. He was the predominant force driving that book. In this book, Tyrion Lannister for sure has a big part in the King's Landing stuff. However, he doesn't really have the presence that Ned had in the first book. It's more like, hey, here's this character that we love, here's stuff that he's doing, here's stuff that's happening with him, and then we jump to another point of view character. And that's fine. I mean, I love reading all these different point of view characters, but it does feel like a more fragmented book than the first book was. And that's something that I didn't really catch on my first read through of this book, and something that just really stuck out to me on the second read through. Again, I still enjoyed A Clash of Kings. I still liked it very much. In fact, I loved portions of this book. The beginning is really good. The ending is fantastic. And the characters are still fantastic as well, and the foreshadowing is amazing. But just that filler in the middle, and then how everything feels sort of fragmented and not as concise and not as centralized as the first book, it does kind of drag a little bit. But all right, guys, I think that's as far as we can go with the spoiler-free stuff. I'm kind of straining to talk about some of the stuff that I really want to delve into. So if you have not read A Clash of Kings or any of the follow-up books after A Clash of Kings, please click off the video now because I'm going full bore on these spoilers. So I will provide a timestamp so you can just skip ahead to the conclusion of this video if you so choose to. If you have read the books, then stick around because we're going to delve into some spoilers. So obviously in this book we have one less point of view character from the first book, as we don't have anything from Eddard Stark's point of view anymore. However, we're introduced to two new characters. One is Davos Seaworth, who resides in Dragonstone, where Stannis Baratheon is High Lord of that region of Westeros, and Theon Greyjoy, who is the son of Balon Greyjoy, who pronounces himself King of the Iron Islands. However, despite the addition of the two new point of view characters, the big new character, who isn't a point of view character, but is a pivotal part of the story, is Stannis Baratheon, Robert Baratheon's younger brother. His story is, despite the fact that he doesn't appear in too many chapters, his presence kind of looms throughout the book. People talk about him. People are fearful of him. There's always all these conversations about like, oh, Stannis Baratheon is coming. Oh, Stannis Baratheon is on his way. Oh, Stannis Baratheon just invaded Storm's End. Now, personally, Stannis is my favorite character in the entire series. He's my favorite of the Five Kings. However, the reason he's my favorite is because the follow-up books recontextualize the character of Stannis for me. You know, I see this man who, you know, goes to the wall and helps Jon Snow. And, you know, I see that and I'm like, okay, he is someone who is bound by honor almost to a comedic effect. He is cold, he's calculating, but I forgot how cruel he is as well. Particularly in the prologue, which is the second longest chapter in the entire series. It's the longest chapter in this book, where you have the point of view of Maester Cresson, and you see Stannis Baratheon was just very cold and very cruel towards his maester. You know, this book doesn't really do Stannis any favors. He delves into some dark magic. He delves into some pretty dark stuff. Melisandre is also intentionally so, but she's also introduced through in kind of a negative light, mainly because Davos perceives her as this kind of shadowy evil presence. It's just something that I caught this reread that I didn't really know about, and I think I was blinded by the follow-up books. It's like, oh yeah, I love Stannis the Manus, but there's some dark stuff there in Stannis's mind for sure. Theon Greyjoy is another character who we delve further deeper into in this book. He does make sporadic appearances alongside Robb Stark in the first book. However, in this book, he's on his own. He's got his own point of view chapters. And when I read A Clash of Kings for the first time, I really hate and despise this character. I was like, what the heck, man? What is he doing? On a second read through, I now see that we're supposed to hate him. We are not supposed to be rooting for this character who betrays this family who raised them for 10 years, the Starks. At first I was like, why are we spending so many chapters with the Theon Greyjoy character? However, knowing what happens to him in the later books, with him being tortured by Ramsay Snow / Ramsay Bolton, we see that, okay, you know, this character has a journey. It's just that we don't know, on a first read through, we don't know what that journey is until we see what becomes of him. We see that he's this broken shell of a man. A Clash of Kings was sort of his quote-unquote rise to being Prince of Winterfell. You know, he took Winterfell from Bran. He kind of made a mockery of the Starks. He slept on Ned Stark's bed. He was just doing all these gross things. He had a bed warmer, just kind of frolicking about, killing Mikken and killing some of the townsfolk left and right, killing the miller's boys. But on the second read through, we now see it through this lens of like, okay, we know that he doesn't really want to betray the Starks. He just chooses to betray the Starks because he wants to seem cool in front of his father. And eventually it just comes back to bite him in the worst way possible in the end. Now having the backdrop of, you know, his terrible family, his sister who just kind of mocks him, his father who has no respect for him, his uncles who are just like laughing at him. Theon Greyjoy sees this like, no, I want the respect of these people. These are the people I'm trying to please. But these are the people that he lost. So it was really interesting for me on the second read through to see that we recognize that those things are mistakes created by his own arrogance. And all he wants to do is be loved. And I guess he pursues that love by pillaging Winterfell and then it eventually being burned by someone else we'll get to in a bit. Ramsay Snow is another character who we are introduced to in this book. And let me tell you guys, it was a ride on this book. So when I first read A Clash of Kings, I didn't watch the show. I didn't know Ramsay Bolton was this huge character. People would talk about the bastard of Bruce Bolton, and I was like, okay, why are we focusing on this? They are building up this character slowly, little by little. This just horrible bastard who goes around flaying people, raping people, killing people, feeding them to his dogs. And then the reveal at the end where the person who's been supposedly helping Theon the whole time, who was calling himself Reek, he was actually Ramsay Bolton the whole time. It's like, oh, okay, I now see why, because it's building towards this the second active villain. And speaking of villains, it was interesting to hear the rumblings of our third active villain, our Euron Crozai Greyjoy, who is, later on we will find out, is the scariest and most dangerous person in the entire continent, potentially the entire world. Despite the fact that when I first read the Iron Islands chapters in A Clash of Kings, I was like, what the heck, like, why do I care about Theon's family? Now I'm like, oh, they're just kind of whispering about, oh, the Crozai. Now I know what it's leading towards. I know what an evil presence he is to become, not just in the fourth and fifth book, but in the Winds of Winter book, where he will play a pivotal role in that book as potentially a central antagonist. Again, the foreshadowing to these characters is great. The other thing I loved was the foreshadowing about big events to come. The foreshadowing of the Red Wedding. We slip in little tiny crumbs about the character of Roose Bolton when it comes to Harrenhal, and he takes over, and Arya is Roose Bolton's cupbearer. Arya doesn't really feel comfortable in the presence of Roose Bolton, and at first, on the first read-through, I didn't really know why. Now on the second read-through, it's like, oh, it's on purpose. We as the audience are supposed to feel kind of like, something is kind of suspicious about this guy, about this Roose Bolton. You know, his allegiance to Robb Stark isn't exactly concrete as Robb Stark is led to believe. And I think the chapter that fully demonstrates that is the last Arya chapter. There is a moment where Roose Bolton's betrayal and his part in the Red Wedding is pretty much front and center for rereaders to kind of pick up on. The passage that I'm referring to reads, "The hunting party returned near Evanfall with 9 dead wolves. 7 were adults, big gray-brown beasts, savage and powerful, their mouths drawn back over their long yellow teeth by their dying snarls. But the other 2 had only been pups. Lord Bolton gave orders for the skins to be sewn into a blanket for his bed. Cubs still have that soft fur, my lord," one of his men pointed out. "Make you a nice warm pair of gloves." Bolton glanced up at the banners waving above the gatehouse towers. "As the Starks are wont to remind us, winter is coming. Have it done." Speaking of people we're not supposed to trust, the Freys are shown to be just these suspicious characters as well. There's a moment in the Arya chapter, again the same Arya chapter, where Roose Bolton shows his true colors, where we kind of get some foreshadowing of the Red Wedding that is to come. She could hear angry voices coming from a window, many men talking and arguing all at once. Almar was sitting on the steps outside, alone. "What's wrong?" Arya asked him when she saw the tears shining on his cheeks. "My princess," he sobbed. "We've been dishonored. Aenys says, there was a bird from the twins. My lord father says I'll need to marry someone else, or be a septon." They know about Robb Stark's breaking of his marriage vows, and the Freys aren't happy. They might just plan a wedding of the red variety. However, as I alluded to earlier, there is stuff that I kind of overlooked on my first read-through that I definitely noticed in my second read-through. The first 3 Daenerys chapters, there's just a lot of meandering around in the Dothraki Sea and meandering around Qarth. I don't really know what purpose it served, I guess other than just to check in on Daenerys. I feel like 2 of the Daenerys chapters could have been combined into one, and the other one we could have easily gotten rid of and nothing would have been lost. Once Daenerys reaches the House of the Undying, then I feel like, okay, this is the stuff that matters. This is something that leads up to something else in the story. Again, some of that Red Wedding foreshadowing happens in the House of the Undying. But again, just some of the Daenerys chapters I feel like are just directionless. There's a Catelyn chapter where she's back at Riverrun and she's with Brienne. When she already had brought Brienne of Tarth back to Riverrun with her. The chapter didn't really serve anything other than to let us know that, hey, Tywin Lannister has left Harrenhal. Where's he gonna go? Jon at Craster's Keep? Like, besides being introduced to the character of Craster, what purpose did that serve? We could have been introduced to Gilly maybe somewhere else in the story. Again, it felt unnecessarily long. Some of the Iron Islands chapters at the beginning where Theon is being orally serviced by a lady. Yes, it is to show us that Theon's not a good character. We're supposed to not like him. I feel like some of those chapters could have been combined. I feel like they could have been shortened and they still would have gotten the point across. They didn't really need to be as long as they needed to. There's a few other chapters there where maybe they didn't have to be removed, but maybe they could have been tightened up more. After reading A Game of Thrones, I was just so enthralled, not just with the story, but, with how fast everything seemed to be going, how properly paced everything was. And with this book, the pacing is great at the beginning, and the pacing is definitely great at the end, which I'll touch on in a bit. But in the middle, it's kind of all over the place, and it makes for a less entertaining read. It was after reading those filler chapters where I was kind of getting to a point where, man, maybe I don't like this book as much as I first remembered it. Like, if A Game of Thrones is an A, maybe an A+ book, at this point in the story, A Clash of Kings was kind of like a C+, maybe a B- on a good day. I was like, man, I'm just not, I still really liked it, and I loved getting to see the characters, but I was getting really just bogged down by some of the filler stuff. However, gosh darn it, everything changes with that Battle of the Blackwater Bay. I think up to this point, the Battle of Blackwater Bay is the only story arc that takes up 70 pages in the whole series. And I'm all for it because it is one action set piece after another. You follow this Battle of the Blackwater Bay through multiple point of view perspectives. You bounce between Davos, Tyrion, and Sansa as they each narrate from different parts of the battle. It's fantastic. I loved it. And I was like, gosh darn it. Oh my gosh. Now I remember why I love this book. It is the only scene in the first 5 books of the Song of Ice and Fire series that carries on through multiple chapters. And it's so good. It's wonderfully done. Again, I didn't watch the show, so I don't know how often they bounce between the multiple characters in the show during this battle, but in the book, it's so well paced. You see as much of the character as you can before you move on. The wildfire, the bridge of ships, the chain, it's all so vivid in your head. It's wonderfully described. It's wonderfully written in this book. It's probably one of my favorite arcs of the whole series. It's definitely my favorite arc in the Clash of Kings, and up to this point in the A Song of Ice and Fire series, it's my favorite arc of the first 2 books. So all in all, I come out of A Clash of Kings feeling, okay, this is a great book. Mainly on the strength of the foreshadowing through a rereader's perspective, and also on those final 170 pages of the A Clash of Kings book. That last story arc is just wonderful. Going on the strength of that alone, the book definitely ended on a high note. However, there's again those filler portions in the middle that I did not really catch on the first read through, that definitely stand out to me on the second read through as sort of unnecessary, where I kind of feel that A Clash of Kings, even though I still really like it and I still think it's a great book, I would say it's a couple rungs short compared to the tall ladder that is A Game of Thrones. If A Game of Thrones, the first book in the series, if that's maybe like a or an A+ book, I would say that A Clash of Kings maybe is like a B+ book. The highs are definitely there, but the lows are lower than they were in A Game of Thrones. But what are you guys' thoughts, guys? Did you enjoy A Clash of Kings when you first read it? Have you reread it since then? Feel free to let me know in the comment section below, guys. If you stuck with me thus far in the video, I hope I was able to provide insight in a concise manner, despite the fact that I didn't have a script. The next video that I will be making will be a review of A Storm of Swords through a rereader's perspective. It's probably going to take me a while to finish that book, but I'm hoping to read that within the coming month. I'm very, very, very interested on reading A Storm of Swords, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Thank you so much for watching this, guys, and I hope to see you guys next time. Until then, The Advocate, out.